Well, greetings, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Norman Goda. I'm the director for the Center of Jewish Studies here at the University of Florida, and I am also the Norman and Irma Bremen Professor of Holocaust Studies here at the University of Florida. Today's event, which we are very pleased to bring you, I should say too, is sponsored by the Norman and Irma Bremen Chair for Holocaust Studies at the University of Florida. I feel very privileged today to introduce my colleague and friend, Jeffrey Herf. Jeffrey is Distinguished University Professor at the University of Maryland. And if you know his many books, all of which have won numerous awards, then you know that these are books that are not just good and interesting reads. They're books that fundamentally change the way that we think about a number of important issues, ranging from memory to the Holocaust, and now to the foundation of Israel. He is the author of Reactionary Modernism, Technology, Culture, and Politics in Weimar and the Third Reich, Divided Memory, The Nazi Past and the Two Germanys, Jewish Enemy, Nazi Propaganda During World War II and the Holocaust, Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, Undeclared Wars with Israel, East Germany and the West German far left, and most recently, having appeared in print just a couple of days ago, Israel's Moment, International Support for and Opposition to Establishing the Jewish State, 1945 to 1949. Here's how the program will work today. Professor Herf is going to speak for about 25, 30 minutes. Then we will discuss a little bit, and we will go to audience questions. If you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A section, and we will get to them. But he is here to discuss his newest book, Israel's Moment. And again, I am delighted to introduce Professor Jeffrey Herf.
Well, Norman, thank you very, very much for that very kind introduction. I have to begin by saying that the University of Florida is enormously fortunate to have Norman Goda as a professor. He is one of the finest historians of modern German and Jewish history in the United States, and his presence there brings great distinction to the university. So it's also an honor for me to be invited and to be participating and to be speaking to an audience in Florida, where I know that there are many people who care very deeply about these events. Historians have a favorite phrase that the past is a foreign country, and Norman kindly made the case that some of my books have changed the way scholars think about certain events. I hope that's the case with Israel's Moment. As many of you who are listening to my voice now know, that there's a story about how Israel was founded, which was a story told by the Soviet Union and the Palestine Liberation Organization, and then filtered into much of world political culture. And the story is that Israel was founded in sin. It was founded in acts of expulsion, racism, colonialism, and that United States, or American imperialism, as the term of art is used, had a great deal to do with the establishment of this terrible state, which victimized the innocent Palestinians, and which thus has no moral legitimacy. These assertions, endlessly repeated in the last half century in the halls of the United Nations and unfortunately in British and American universities in some departments, are all false. So the past is a foreign country means that we need to look at some of these famous and familiar events that, quote, everybody knows what happened, and to recall what actually took place. And that is what Israel's moment attempts to do. The core arguments, the three core arguments of this about 500-page book are the following. First, while President Harry Truman's support for the Zionist project was crucial, the support by the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc was even more consequential. And that support was evident in diplomatic battles at the United Nations, and also when the communist government of Czechoslovakia violated the UN arms embargo and sent arms to the Jews when they needed it most during the 1948 war, at the same time that the United States and Britain and then the United Nations were enforcing an arms embargo. The window of opportunity for the establishment of the Jewish state was brief, and it was made possible, first of all, and most importantly, by the Jews in Palestine themselves, the Zionists, but also by the fresh memories of the Holocaust and the anti-Nazi passions in its immediate aftermath, passions that were evident among American liberals, French socialists, in the Soviet bloc, and also in a cross-section of American political opinion. So Israel's moment took place at a turning point in global politics, as the alliances of the Second World War were giving way to the very different and reversed early coalitions of the coalition of the early Cold War. The Zionist project emerged between the binaries of communism and anti-communism, West and East, a fact that confounded decision makers in Moscow, Paris, London, and Washington, but was well understood by the two leading figures of the Zionist project, David Ben-Gurion, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, and future Foreign Minister Moshe Sharett. And the book draws attention to what I regard as their wisdom, their political courage, and their astuteness. Ben-Gurion, in my view, is one of the great political figures of the 20th century, right up there with Churchill and Roosevelt. And his political greatness is not yet sufficiently recognized outside of Israel. Second, perhaps due to the understandable attention devoted to President Truman's support for the UN partition resolution in November 29, 1947, and then to his decision to recognize the state of Israel on May 14th, when it was founded in 48, historians have not paid sufficient attention to the emphatic, resolute, persistent, and consequential opposition to the Zionist project from the United States Department of State, the Department of Defense, and the Central Intelligence Agency. Israel's moment presents more evidence than has appeared in the scholarship up to now about an anti-Zionist consensus that emerged not on the contemporary left, but that emerged at the top of the United States national security establishment and was led by Secretary of State, former five-star General George C. Marshall, and articulated by the first director of the new policy planning staff, the by then very famous, brilliant, and articulate George F. Kennan. These leaders viewed the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine as a threat to American and Western access to Arab oil resources, which were needed for the economic construction of Western Europe and the Marshall Plan, and that the Jewish state would be a boon, an advantage to prospects for Soviet and communist expansion in the Middle East. This association of the Zionist project with communism and the Soviet Union was pervasive, especially in the British Foreign Office, but also in the American State Department and even more so in the Pentagon. Therefore, the leaders of the Anglo-American national security establishment in London and Washington viewed the establishment of the Jewish state as a threat to national security interests of the United States and as a threat to the global policy of containment of the Soviet Union and communism. While this was well known to New Deal liberals such as Robert Wagner and Emanuel Seller and Sumner Wells and others I'll mention in a moment, it has been this opposition of the American national security establishment, the establishment of the state of Israel, has faded into the background in part because of President Truman's fame and his crucial decisions. But there was only so much that the president could do when he was faced with a national security establishment led by Marshall and others who were determined to try to prevent it. Third, the third point, support for the establishment of the Jewish state, support for the establishment encompassed both the Democratic and Republican parties. the most famous supporter of the Jewish state in the Republican Party was the Republican senator from Ohio, Robert Taft, who had abandoned his isolationist sentiments of the late 1930s. But the loudest and the most persistent voices in the political realm in the United States and outside the formal organizations of the Jewish community and the synagogues and the Zionist organizations came from the most prominent liberal politicians in American politics and from prominent liberal, left liberal, and leftist journalists and intellectuals. So figures such as the New Dealer Robert Wagner, author of the Social Security Act, Congressman Emanuel Seller, active in revising racist American immigration laws, former Assistant Secretary of State Sumner Wells, the editor of the Nation, of the left-wing weekly The Nation, Frida Kirchway, I.F. Stone, contributor to The Nation, to the left-wing, left liberal newspaper PM, left-leaning dailies such as PM and the New York Post, all of whom denounced the Nazi collaborationist past of the leaders of the Arab Higher Committee. More about that in a moment. And they, the New Dealers, the liberals, the leftists, viewed the Zionist project as part of a broader global anti-colonial struggle, an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggle against the British Empire in the Middle East. And that the Zionist project for them was a logical continuation of the anti-Nazi, anti-fascist, anti-racist passions following World War II and the Holocaust. They rejected the accusations that there was a connection between the Zionist project and Soviet and communist expansion in the Middle East. These were the realities of 1947-48. In the fall of 1949, as many of you know, the Soviet Union launched an anti-Semitic, anti-cosmopolitan set of purges in Moscow and in Eastern Europe, in which it asserted, in which Stalin had concluded that Israel was not going to be an appendage of Soviet influence, that the Zionists in their overwhelming majority were not communists. Some of them, many of them were democratic socialists. And after 1949, the Soviet Union embarked on one of the most successful propaganda campaigns of 20th century global history, in which it sought to reverse the realities of Israel's moment and blame the United States for Israel's emergence. It was silent about the evidence of Soviet and communist support for the Jews in Israel, and it spread the consequential falsehood that Israel was a product of US imperialism. In the United States, the importance of Soviet-era support for the Zionists and the realities of opposition in the power ministries of the United States government was lost in an exaggeration of the importance of Truman's decision-making and minimization of the impact of opposition from the American and British national security establishment. Israel's Moment is a book that seeks to bring the international and national political realities of those years, the past as a foreign country, to the attention of a contemporary readership. And what I'd like to do now is share the screen and talk through some images and photos from that time so that we can connect the images to the events. That's the title. The book is just published. It is available now in this country on Amazon. That's the cover. The cover shows the arrival of the ship, the Exodus, made famous, well, very famous at the time, and then famous again in Leon Uris's novel and in the film. That is the actual ship, a ramshackle event that was reconditioned in the port of Baltimore, which infuriated the British Foreign Office no end. More about that in a moment. I want to draw attention to the American Zionist Emergency Council and the role of Abba Silver, Stephen Wise, and others in 1945, summer of 1945 and 1946. They made efforts to encourage the State Department to bring the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, to trial for war crimes based upon his by then world famous radio broadcasts and other activities in collaboration with the Nazi regime. And one of the things I found most fascinating in the research in the National Archives here in Washington, D.C., College Park, was the amount of evidence already available in 1945-46 of his collaboration. The AZAC memos are some of the most interesting documents in the book, but Wise and Silver and others were unable to convince Robert Jackson in Nuremberg, Telford Taylor, and the Secretary, the State Department in Washington to bring Husseini to trial. The absence of a trial of Husseini, in my view, is an important chapter in the history of amnesia and forgetting that accompanied the early Cold War. So I view that as part of a turn away from the passions of anti-fascism, in the hope that lenient treatment towards people such as Husseini would assist the Western Cold War in the Middle East. This is a photo. You're looking at a photo now of the Middle East experts of the State Department: George Wadsworth, Loy Henderson, most importantly, Loy Henderson, the director of the State Department Office of Middle East and African Affairs, and Colonel William Eddy on the right. Henderson, these gentlemen made the argument that the national security interests of the United States in the Middle East was synonymous with the continued presence of the British Empire, and that the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine would undermine British presence and would facilitate the entry of Soviet influence in the Middle East. William Eddy was the American ambassador to Saudi Arabia, also for a while worked with the Arab American oil company Aramco, and he wrote consequential memos in 1940, the fall of the summer and fall of 47, that and he was an appointee of Secretary of State George Marshall, asserting that the establishment of a Jewish state would be a disaster for American national interest, and that the United States government should oppose it. The years of 1945 to 1947 in New York and in Washington were years of momentum in support of the establishment of the Jewish state. And this is a photo in I think it's the New York Herald American, I believe, of a rally in Madison Square Garden on June 12, 1946, and there are the slogans: "Escape for the Nazi Mufti," that is Husseini, but no rescue for Nazi victims. And the theme of the speeches at the rally were that the opposition to establishment of the State of Israel from the State Department and from the British Foreign Office was a turn away from the passions of the Second World War, and urging that the Mufti be brought to trial or there be indicted. These efforts were unsuccessful. So one of the things that becomes obvious was that what the Jews or what the activist organizations of the American Jewish community were hoping to see happen, that is an indictment in 1945-46, did not happen. And it's very important to remember the limits on Jewish political power in the United States, because as many of you who are listening know, the notion that the Jews had a disproportionate impact on American foreign relations is one of those canards that keeps reappearing. I'll come back to well, I mean, I think I'm going to have to skip over a bit because there's some other points I would like to make, but that is a photo of Emanuel Seller. He was the spark plug. There's no one in the Congress, with the possible exception of Robert Wagner, who did as much to make the case for the Zionist project than as Emanuel Seller. He was a really remarkable figure. And working in the Seller papers at the Library of Congress really was fascinating. And he was in every way, this graduate of Brooklyn College was in every way the intellectual equal of the Ivy League graduates of Yale, Harvard, and Princeton, such as Lovett and Kennan. In every way, they're intellectual equal. And the memos that he wrote to them were just as impressive as the memos for which Kennan became famous. So one of the things that I hope the book will do is to bring much deserved attention to the intellectual and political interventions of Emanuel Seller. And Robert Wagner as well was a remarkable figure who was particularly important for stimulating Protestant and Catholic support for the establishment of the Jewish state. Wagner denounced what he called appeasement of the Arab Higher Committee and was really emphatic. He wrote to Marshall urging him to release documents about the Nazi collaboration of Husseini and others, without success. One of the fascinating aspects for me as a historian of German history was for the first time to work in French archives. My French is good enough for that. My French colleagues would, their ears would hurt a great deal when I spoke French to them, but it was good enough. It was certainly good enough to do research in the French National Archives in Pierrefitte. If there are historians here who are listening, you do go to Pierrefitte. It's a fantastic archive. And also in the diplomatic archives in another suburb of Paris, La Courneuve. And this is a picture of Henri Pinceau. No reason any of you should have heard of him. French High Commissioner in Syria from 1926 to 1933, and then back in Paris. And in April of 1945, the French military arrested Jamal Husseini in Germany. And then they brought him to Switzerland, and then from Switzerland, he was placed under house arrest in or near Paris. And he was there from June of 45 to June of 46. And the year-long house arrest of Husseini is a fascinating and important chapter. The French government could have decided to indict him for war crimes or deliver him to Nuremberg or for that matter, to Yugoslavia, where there was some talk of doing that. But the Arab League and Arab states made clear that they thought that would be a terrible idea. And the conversations that Husseini had with Henri Pinceau are absolutely fascinating. And I hope that readers of the book will appreciate their importance, because the French had him in custody, and they could have they could have done the indictment, but instead they reached the conclusion that the continued presence of a French, if not empire, at least French political influence in the Arab world required leniency toward this former Nazi collaborator. So the French Foreign Ministry, like the British Foreign Office, like the State Department, tilted to the Arabs and away from the Zionists. Now, another point that many of you may have heard, and especially since the Zionism is Racism resolution of the United Nations in 1975, was that Zionism somehow had something to do with racism. Terrible thing. Turns out that Jamal Husseini, Jamal Husseini's cousin, made two interesting speeches. The first in January 47 in London, and then again in September in 1947 at the United Nations near New York. This speech is of great historical significance. and September 16th, excuse me, on September 29th of 1947, he was speaking for the Arab Higher Committee, which had the observer status at the United Nations, to justify the struggle against the Zionist invasion, which he insisted had, quote, nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Zionist organizations, he said, cynically exploited the anti-Semitism argument for their own purposes. But in a part of his speech, which has been long overlooked, but has been in the records of the United Nations that are public and not classified, they've long been available, this is what he said in September of 1947 as to why he thought the establishment of this Jewish state was such a terrible idea. This is Jamal Husseini. The Arab world is a racial homogeneity that extends over the southern and parts of the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean Sea, from the north of Africa throughout Egypt to the Persian Gulf, and from the Turkish borders to the Indian Ocean. The people of that vast territory speak one language and have the same history, traditions, and aspirations. Their unity in all those matters is a basis for mutual understanding and a solid foundation for peace in one of the most central and sensitive areas of the world. With these characteristics, the Arab world affords a conspicuous contrast to the nations that occupy the northern seaboard of the Mediterranean. There, the diversity of interests, mentalities, where their different nationalities and non-homogeneous communities have clashed in a diversity of interests and mentalities and national aims. This condition created an atmosphere of antagonism that culminated in a calamitous war. So Husseini's view of Europe was that the diversity of cultures and the diversity of nations had fostered war in Europe, whereas the homogeneity of race, that's his words, and cultures in the Middle East was a formula for peace. And therefore, the introduction of religious diversity into this previously homogeneous racial unity in the Middle East in the form of the Zionist project was to be rejected. In other words, and I'll be blunt, Jamal Husseini was a racist, and made that point very, very publicly, very clearly, that the thing that was terrible about Zionism was that it would destroy the racial homogeneity of the Middle East. One of the great propaganda successes of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the Arab League, the Arab Higher Committee, the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, the global left, one of the great propaganda accomplishments of the last 70 years is to have obscured the racism of the Arab Higher Committee in 1947-48 as a reason as to why they rejected the Zionist project. Sumner Welles is a figure that I also bring attention to. He was a Undersecretary of State in the Roosevelt administration. Here he is speaking in Baltimore to the American Christian Palestine Committee, another New Dealer and liberal who criticized the State Department in a book called We Need Not Wait. This is a photo on the left of Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet ambassador to the Soviet Union. Many of you are familiar with Gromyko's famous speech in May of '47, in which he stunned the United Nations by asserting that the Soviet Union was in favor of a two-state solution. This was at a time when the United States was hemming and hawing and talking about the importance of appointing a committee to see if that would be a good idea. But Gromyko thought it was a good idea. And then in the middle is Alfred Federkivich, a man who many of you probably have never heard of, but Alfred Federkivich was the Polish representative to the United Nations. And Alfred Federkivich was also a survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And he stunned the United Nations in May of '47 when he said, Polish Jews and Jews from all over Europe were brought into the extermination camps erected by the Nazis on Polish soil and perished there in gas chambers. I was there myself, and I saw 1.5 to 2 million burned in crematoria. Our people were witnesses to this mass tragedy. We cannot forget it. We shall not forget it. And then he went on to assert his support for the Zionist project, Alfred Federkivich. Because I promised Norman I would only speak for 30 minutes, I'm going to violate my promise and speak for another 5 minutes because there are some other things that I want to say. that handshake between President Truman and Secretary of State George Marshall illustrates what they agreed on. The two very famous anti-communists, two very famous architects of containment and the geostrategic policies of the United States in 1947-48. In the spring of 47, Truman gave the Truman Doctrine speech, and in June of 47, George Marshall gave the commencement address at Harvard University, in which he articulated the importance of something that came to be called the Marshall Plan, named after him. The establishment of the State of Israel, in Marshall's view, was something that would make it very difficult to implement the Marshall Plan, because Western Europe needed oil. And in his view, the establishment of the Jewish state would undermine Western access to oil. There's Gromyko speaking in November of 47, again in support of the partition resolution. There's I.F. Stone. I.F. Stone became a very famous left liberal journalist. And he denounced what he called red baiting from the State Department, as the State Department associated the Zionist project with communism and the Soviet Union. There is a picture of Undersecretary of State Robert Lovett, and on the right, the director of the planning staff, George Kennan. George Kennan, I would assume all of you are familiar with Kennan, probably the most brilliant and articulate strategic thinker of the State Department, the author of Containment, a brilliant writer, a superb scholar, admirable in so many ways. But Kennan took the opposition to the establishment of the State of Israel beyond the level of the Arab diplomats, the American ambassadors to the Arab world, and he made it a consensus within the State Department, and of course it already was a consensus within the Pentagon. The Kennan memos in the policy planning staff of January and February of 1948 argued that the partition plan was a mistake. The United States should abandon it. It should try to continue some kind of trusteeship over former British Mandate Palestine. And this was Kennan. This was not Loy Henderson. This was not William Eddy. This was not one of the Arabists. This was George Kennan. And George Kennan had been appointed by George Marshall. And so there you had some of the most famous, most consequential leaders of American foreign relations making this case. And there is Marshall shaking hands with Ernst Bevin. I don't have time to talk about Bevin. We can speak about him in question and answer if you want. I don't have time to go into the French dimension. There's Clark Clifford. Clifford wrote the memos for President Truman saying, Mr. President, the establishment of the State of Israel is going to be good for containment, because the State of Israel is going to be a democracy, and the Zionists are not communists, and the Arabs have to sell their oil to somebody, and they're going to sell it to us. So don't worry, go ahead and recognize this state. And he gave Truman the arguments that the architect of containment and the Cold War needed to hear. Eleanor Roosevelt was a firm supporter of the Zionist project. And I want to close with this, because I don't want to break my promise to Norman too badly. The United Nations Security Council has permanent members, and it has rotating members. And in the spring and summer of 1948, the Ukrainian SSR was a member of the Security Council, and the Ukrainian ambassador to the United Nations was a man named Vasyl Tarasenko. And you're looking at, on the left, in the front row, Vasyl Tarasenko. Next to Andrei Gromyko, left center. On right center is Noel Baker, the British ambassador to the UN. And then on the right, Warren Austin, he's a little bit cut off, who was the American ambassador to the United Nations. And I'm ending with this. because obviously it connects to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Putin's outrageous comments about about Ukrainians as Nazis. And I wanted to bring attention to this moment of Ukrainian anti-fascism. In the spring of 1948, Count Foco Bernadotte had proposed that the state of Israel, that the map of the state of Israel be changed, and that Israel give up the Negev desert. And Tarasenko responded to these proposals and to various British and American truce resolutions on May 28th. This is Tarasenko, who became the chair of the history department at Taras Shevchenko University of Kiev in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, being a historian. The British ceasefire proposal, he said, was designed to stifle the state of Israel. At the end of the 4-week period, the Jews would find their resources depleted while the Arabs would be prepared for a renewed onslaught. All the larger arsenals of the United Kingdom would be at the disposal of the Arabs, and a virtual blockade would be established around Israel. The whole draft resolution was biased and unacceptable. And that summer, Tarasenko and Gromyko made common cause with Abba Eban and Moshe Chertok, the Israeli representatives of the United Nations, in opposing the British and American truce resolutions and the Bernadotte plan, which would have amputated a significant part of the new state of Israel. And the last point I want to make is an anecdote about David Ben-Gurion, who, I repeat what I said at the outset, really is one of the great political figures of world history in the 20th century, not just of Jewish history or Zionist history. He really is, his President Truman, at the urging of the State Department, had in May of '49 wrote that the United States would have to reconsider its relations with Israel because the Israelis were not pursuing policies regarding refugees and borders that the United States favored. And this threat came with a reminder of all the things the United States had done for Israel, and that weren't the Israelis being ungrateful. And James MacDonald, whose diaries Norman and others did such a superb job of editing, summarized then Prime Minister Ben-Gurion's objections as follows. The November 29 resolution was never carried out by the UN, the United States, or the Middle East states. It contemplated two states, Israel and an independent Arab Palestine. But he was unable to recall any strong action by the US to enforce the November 29th resolution or to prevent aggression by Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, and Iraq. And instead, the United States embargo encouraged the aggressors against Israel, whose very existence was in danger. And this is Ben-Gurion. Had Jews waited on the United States or the United Nations, they would have been exterminated. It was very blunt. Ben-Gurion was not, quote, eloquent in the way that some others are, but he could get to the point. So I conclude, the realities of British, but especially American official opposition, as well as Soviet bloc, leftist and liberal support for the establishment of the Jewish state faded from world politics. Following the Soviet turn against Israel during the anti-cosmopolitan campaign, the global left told a very different story. And that was a story that replaced the actual realities of 1945 to 49 with influential fictions of Zionism as a form of racism and as a tool of American imperialism, and an embarrassed silence about the support for the Jews from the communists in 1947 to spring 49. In fact, the forgetting of the Nazi collaboration of the leaders of Arab Higher Committee and the guilty association of Zionism with communism were aspects of the early years of the Western Cold War. Israel's moment was that brief period when the passions of anti-fascism had not yet been displaced or modified by those of global containment and anti-communism. My apologies to Norman for talking too long.
Not at
But,
all. Not at all.
but I will now stop sharing the screen, and I look forward to comments and your comments and questions.
Thank you, Jeff. That was wonderful. I think I'm going to try and bring out a couple of these points a little bit, and then we'll turn it over to questions from the audience. It seems to me that we tend to look at Israel's war of independence in complete isolation, and that one of the things your book does is to set it squarely within Cold War politics, and you talked a lot about that, and squarely within what would later be called Holocaust memory, that is the aftermath of the Holocaust, which you didn't get a chance to talk about quite as much, and so maybe I can bring that out a little bit. It seems to me that you're telling us something very new about the communist world, about French, former French resistors too, and their reading of the Holocaust. And this is sort of what I'm getting at. Anybody who works in this area is familiar with the fact that the Soviets and the Poles really repressed any notion that the fate of the Jews during World War II was unique. The Soviets would not allow a memorial at Babi Yar, which is timely these days. They got rid of the Jewish anti-fascist committee. We know about Poland thanks to Jan Gross's work, and anybody who works on France can tell you about the opening French statement at Nuremberg by a former French resistor that went on for 4 hours and never mentioned the Jews, or the burial of an urn of ashes from Auschwitz at Père Lachaise Cemetery, where nary a word about the Jews was spoken. It sort of became a communist event. I urge people to read your book because you're saying something very different. You're saying that, Gromyko, that Federkivich, the Polish representative, and therefore these governments at the UN, and the French Interior Ministry as well, which is made up of former resistors, and the French communists, all were very strongly behind the idea of Zionism as not only a national liberation movement and an anti-imperialist movement, but a simple decent response to the fact that European Jewry was practically annihilated. The Soviets acknowledge it at the UN, the Poles acknowledge it, the French communists acknowledge it, and the former French resistors in the Interior Ministry, as they're allowing Jewish refugees to sail to Palestine, all acknowledge it, and they acknowledge it publicly. And if I read your book properly, they're acknowledging it in such a way that it's not just some cynical political thing, that this is something they feel very deeply. How are we to reconcile these two things? The fact that we seem to have domestically an absolute refusal to acknowledge the specificity of Hitler's final solution on the one hand, and this strong, powerful acknowledgement publicly at the UN and elsewhere of the Holocaust on the other, when it comes to Zionism and the justice of the Zionist project.
Well, that's an excellent comment and question, because I've thought about it, and I think that for Stalin, this was power politics, and the supporting the Zionist project for Stalin was he hoped a policy that would drive the British out of the Middle East, and would indeed expand Soviet influence in the Middle East, and that the Jews coming from Eastern and Central Europe would be more sympathetic to the Soviet Union, and it was not an expensive policy to pursue. I mean, why not try it? So, but there was another tradition within Soviet foreign policy represented by Maxim Litvinov in the 1930s, and by I forget Maisky's first name, the Soviet ambassador to Britain during a kind of popular front tradition, and that's what one heard from Tarasenko and Gromyko and Federkivich at the United Nations. It was for them. It wasn't just power politics. I mean, Gromyko was quite a survivor. I still don't. I'm not quite sure. I don't really understand how Gromyko avoided getting thrown into prison after his speeches in 47, 48. But comment, they were human beings too. I mean, so I don't want to romanticize. And the Soviet turn was swift and brutal and consequential. But the fact is that when the Jews needed arms in the spring and summer of 1948, the United States and Britain were imposing a blockade. The United Nations was blockading them, and the arms came from Czechoslovakia, probably with approval of Stalin. So the reaction, the meaning of left and right in 1947-48 concerning the establishment of the State of Israel was, if you were opposed to imperialism and opposed to colonialism and you favored a racism, then you would have supported the Zionists. And if you were in favor of the continued presence of the British Empire in the Middle East, then you would have supported the Arab states. Your question raises, your comment and question raises this sort of broader issue about the history of the Soviet Union and communism, and that is from between 1917 and 1989, the period of 1941 to 1945, or let's say the period of 1941 to 1940, the summer of 1948, is the exception in the entire history of the Soviet Union and communism. It's in that period where the possibility of some kind of rapprochement with Western imperialism, whatever, however cynical or however well-meaning, existed, and in London and in Washington, in the halls of power, the more the Soviet Union and Poland and Czechoslovakia supported the establishment of the State of Israel, the more people like Kennan and Marshall and Ernst Bevin felt convinced that they were right, that Zionism was part of a Soviet, they wouldn't use the word plot, but the Soviet policy to expand influence in the Middle East. So I too was struck by, I did not expect to see what I found. One can say, well, Gromyko and Federkivich, they're diplomats, and of course they know how to spin a nice story and make people cry and blah blah blah. But there's a point at which people sometimes say what they actually feel and mean, and it's very striking reading those UN documents that there's Tarasenko and Gromyko, and they're fighting with Warren Austin and Noel Baker and Avi Iban and Moshe Shertak are getting up and agreeing with them. This is something that's just been lost in the last 50, 60 years, and that is it's a terrible shame that the Soviet Union made that turn. But and the other point to be made, and I just this answer is a little bit longer than the United States. Part of the United States did not become a close and consequential ally of the state of Israel until after the Six-Day War in 1967. John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson sent some more weapons, but the most important ally of the state of Israel from 1949 to 1967 was France. And one of the things about the book that I want to emphasize is that after the Soviet Union turned against Israel in 1949, the State Department and the Pentagon kept their distance for all the reasons that I present in the book, and that if it hadn't been for France, it's an open question whether the Israelis would have had the weapons to have defend themselves when the state was very young and very vulnerable.
I have another question, but my colleague Roy Holler, our specialist in Israel studies, has his hand up. Roy, I'm not sure how this is going to work. I'm going to hit the button that says allow to talk. And then I guess you talk. So let's see how this works. Oh, there he is. Oh, how about that? We don't see you. Roy? Okay, well, I'll ask another question while we're waiting for Roy. The other issue about Holocaust memory, you talk a lot about the Near Eastern division within the State Department, and the State Department itself. And you talk a lot about how for them, the Holocaust simply never occurred. You know, there was mistreatment of the Jews, but certainly not enough to justify the geopolitical concerns that they had.
Excuse me. Yes.
It sort of occurs to me that these were the exact same guys who during the war were getting information on the final solution and ascribing it all to Jewish paranoia and in fact suppressing information as it came from Switzerland, right? Yeah. Even as the Swedes, for example, were getting the same information and acting on it, you know, saving Jews where they could. And guys like Loy Henderson, who at the time was the minister in Baghdad, or William Eddy, who was the minister in Saudi Arabia, were always completely exasperated that they couldn't get Roosevelt to just close the door on any possibility of Israel, of Palestine being a place that Jews could go. If you sort of go through the records of 43, 44, it says, why can't we get Roosevelt to understand what a disaster this is going to be? And then Roosevelt, who had this, you know, very inconsequential Secretary of State at the end, Stettinius, he dies, and then they got Truman. And then Truman appoints Marshall, you know, a man of tremendous stature. And you know, I always sort of had the impression, and I'm wondering if you agree, that they sort of felt, well, you know, now we got this rube from Missouri, you know, we can probably sort of roll him. And it seems to me that on a couple of occasions they kind of try to do this. The UN trusteeship proposal, for example, which would have obviated the partition resolution. Is this an impression that you get as well? Because it really makes Truman's policy look that much more sharp in relief, you know, that this wasn't just Truman acting on an impulse, it was Truman having to overcome a tremendous amount of opposition that really went back to his predecessor.
Well, to the listeners, I mean, I agree with your interpretation of the State Department during the war and then after the war, and it underscores the Truman was really the exception that proved the rule. He was the only significant architect of the Cold War, of the policy of containment, who was also a Zionist, or rather, if not a Zionist, who supported the establishment of the Jewish state. He was alone. He was up against a man who was perhaps almost as famous as the President of the United States, in George Marshall. There was nobody. There was not anyone else in the State Department and in the Pentagon who were making the case for the establishment of the Jewish state. He was alone. Finally, he got fed up with them in the spring of '48, and he pulled policy back into the White House. But when you read the Pentagon talks of fall '47, or Kennan's memos, they read as if well, the president thinks this, but so what? One of the things, I don't belabor it in the book, but this is a moment that underscores the absence of Jewish power in American politics. If the Jews were powerful in 1947, 46, 47, Hashim bin al-Husseini would have been placed on trial. There were sufficient grounds to indict him for war crimes. There were German propagandists who were convicted for doing the same thing that he did. No indictment of Husseini. If the Jews were powerful, the United States would have sent weapons to the Jews. No weapons to the Jews. If the Jews were powerful, the path for immigrants, Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, from Europe to Palestine in 1946, 47, 48 would have been much easier. But here was the crux. If you're in the State Department, who are you going to support? Your ally Britain, with whom you've just fought a 4-year war, and you have lots of personal connections, and not to mention you saved the world, blah blah, from Nazism, and Britain is still, if not the great British Empire, it's still a very significant power in the world. Are you going to choose them as you're trying to contain the Red Army in Europe, or are you going to choose a non-existent state in former British Palestine by a bunch of Jews who, some of whom call themselves democratic socialists? It's like a no-brainer. Of course, give me a break. So, but this sense of vulnerability, of the absence of power, is one that comes through very, very clearly. And Chertok gives a really brilliant speech. It was one of my favorite documents in the whole book, in May of is that May of '49 or 48 or 49, and he goes through what happened at the United Nations. And he's a brilliant diplomat, so he doesn't use a lot of proper names and doesn't say nasty things about particular people. But it's clear that he's aware that at crucial points, American and British diplomacy was opposed to the Zionist project, and at other points, the Soviet bloc was not. So Ben-Gurion and Chertok say, our policy is good relations with the United States and good relations with the Soviet Union. This is not what American and British officials wanted to hear in 1948, 49. And one more point about the Holocaust memory, and this gets into that issue about what did the Jews remember, and were people silent and all that. So in 1945, 46, 47, for the Jews in the United States and France and everywhere else, the issues were stark of survival or not survival. And the memory of the Holocaust in those early years, with the exception of some historians or historically minded people, was not primarily about collecting all the evidence about what happened in Auschwitz and Treblinka and all that, though there was Laura Jakush and others who pointed out that this was going on. The point was that we didn't want to get killed anymore, right? We wanted to live, and we couldn't count on these other countries, and now we wanted sovereignty of our own. And the memory of the Holocaust was the memory of powerlessness. And we don't want that anymore. So the real memory of the Holocaust was mediated through support for the Zionist project. It wasn't that people were heartless or forgot about what happened to the Jews of Europe, but because this must not happen again, the Jews needed to be armed and have a state of their own. So the Holocaust memory and the establishment of the state were far more connected to one another than than perhaps we have appreciated.
Right, yeah, and I just follow up. I'll get to the two questions in a second. I've always felt that the exasperation with Israel in the United States and in the UN in 1948, 1949, is that Jewish leaders had always come to the world as supplicants with their hat in hand, please help us. And for the first time, Jews were saying no. No, we're not going to let an Egyptian army camp out in the Negev desert and cut off our settlements there. No, we're not going to, just sort of pretend Jerusalem can be this international city under international protection. It didn't work the first time, and it's just no, we're not going to do it this way. It speaks to your point, that we're not sacrificing security. I want to get to a couple of questions.
Let me
John,
say,
go ahead.
In 1945, Abba Silver and the AZAC representatives, in their memo, when they're writing to the State Department urging an indictment of Husseini, say, we do not have sovereignty, but we do not have the power to bring him to trial, but you do. But you do. And that underscores the point you're making.
Jonathan Nelson asks, in 1949, why did the Soviet Union turn against Israel? It's a little bit a postscript to your book. But
the first Israeli elections revealed that the Israeli Communist Party got something like 2 or 3% of the vote, and it became obvious to Stalin that Ben Gurion and Chertok and the Zionist generation of leaders were not communists. They were Democrats with a small d. They wanted to have nothing to do with dictatorship. And that his bet on Zionism as a tool against imperialism turned out to have been mistaken. And the Arabs had the oil, and for Stalin personally, and here a biographer of Stalin, I'd have to look at Stephen Kotkin's or other, discussions of Stalin's turn, Laurent Rooker in France, perhaps. He was an anti-Semite. He didn't like Jews. So the policy of support for the Zionist project may have been very uncomfortable for him, and he was glad to give up the charade. But the anti-cosmopolitan campaigns in Europe were a return to traditions of anti-Semitism that had also been part of the communist tradition, beginning with Marx. There was the whole business about the international conspiracy and the power of the Jews trying to overthrow the communists, and so it was a kind of return to normalcy. The communist tradition was not entirely or all a tradition of anti-Semitism. I'm not saying that. But the period of 1941 to 47, 48 was also an exceptional period.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. This is, I'll read it, and then of the various officials who closed the door to Jews during the war and opposed Zionism thereafter, what were their attitudes later on? Were they most self-justifying, or were some apologetic for their earlier actions? In other words, did the Kennans, the Marshalls, and so on, did they ever say, man, did we get this wrong? Or did they sort of stick by their guns?
I didn't explore the State Department in the 50s and 60s, but I think these attitudes remained very intact in the State Department and the Pentagon for a long time. The United States, in their view, was on the wrong side global anti-colonialism and the wrong side of access to oil. A lot of it came down to oil. No, there was no,
No deep soul searching from that.
no. I mean, the big turn, I mean, it was a gradual turn under Kennedy and Johnson, but the big turn took place under Nixon. Well, really under Johnson, I suppose. When the Israelis won the Six-Day War, and the United States was, in the quagmire in Vietnam, it dawned on people in the Pentagon, not because they had some moral awakening, but that the Israelis had actually defeated Soviet armaments, and that it was then that the American alliance with Israel really took shape, first under Johnson, and then even more ironically under Nixon. Yeah, that's a whole other story about the Yom Kippur War and Nixon saving Israel. Really, he did. He and Kissinger, but people don't like to hear that, but it's true. And so what historians, what we want to try and recover realities at the time, rather than project the present into the past. And because of the American alliance with Israel had been so powerful and for so long, people projected it back into 1947, 48. And that wasn't the case. I don't want to take anything away from Truman. I mean, his recognition decision was remarkable, but he was up against the whole national security establishment.
Yeah. And
so while he could do the recognition decision, sending weapons when they needed them most, that was a bridge too far.
But getting to the sort of bad Roosevelt, good Truman narrative, one of the things that strikes me is that once you had this recognition, Truman really needed things explained to him. When you referenced the Bernadotte plan, whereby they were going to try and create something in Israel the Arabs could live with by giving the Negev to Egypt and Jordan, whereupon Ben Gurion had this wonderful line, "Why do the Egyptians need more desert?" But and it would have cut.
Why do the Russians need more land? I mean,
11
time zones is not enough.
But by this time, it sort of reminds us that the center of global geopolitics wasn't Israel, it was Berlin, or in 1949, it was China. And, it really had to be explained to Roosevelt. I'm sorry, really had to be explained to Truman, by his ambassador in Israel. This is why the Negev matters. And this is why the Israelis are going to reject the Bernadotte plan, because Truman was like, well, I did my bit. I recognize the country, they exist, and now they should really sort of pay me back by accepting these things. But again, the Israelis weren't going to.
Well, Truman could have fired Warren Austin and appointed Eleanor Roosevelt as the American ambassador to the United Nations in the summer of 1948, and really opened up a split within the State Department. And had Eleanor Roosevelt, who had, of course, international stature, fighting with George Marshall publicly. He didn't. The priority of the United States in 1947-48 was containing the Soviet Union and the beginning of the Cold War, and everything else was secondary, including establishing the Jewish state. And if Truman could be convinced that the Jewish state would not undermine containment and was compatible with the policy of the Truman Doctrine, then he would support it. And that was what Clark Clifford did. Clark Clifford gave his boss, said, "Boss, you want to hear some arguments about why you can be a scary anti-communist and support the Zionists? Here are the arguments," right? But he wasn't hearing them from anyone else in the government. You know, he heard them from Emanuel Seller and from Robert Wagner, and yeah, I mean, there are pages of the New York Times which show the Berlin airlift on one side of the page, and tensions heating up in Europe, and on the other, the War of 1948 is taking place. They're taking place at the same time. Mm-hmm. So Kennan and Marshall are saying, Mr. President, you know, the main national security interests of the United States are to contain the Soviet Union and communism. And that is the lens through which we are looking at the establishment of the Jewish state. And we regard that establishment as a problem. And you need to see it as a problem too, because you're the president of the United States. You're not the president of Israel, right? So whose national security are you really most concerned about? It was, you know, it's not easy to be the president of the United States. And, you know, and so in that sense, yeah.
I finally have our question from my colleague, Roy Holler. He had AV problems, so he typed it out. On the question of colonialism, I noticed that the narrative that was presented in pre-Israel Palestine, specifically in early pro-Zionist films that were marketed to Americans in order to solicit donations, these be newsreels and so forth, were drawn in colonial imperial themes. It was presented as barren desert with only nomadic tribes going through, maybe a few religious Jews praying in Jerusalem, all waiting for the boats for the West, carrying the Jews who will take over the country and rescue it from its backwardness. Other films open with pioneers walking through the landscape, walking and walking as if conquering the land, and then they tame it. Of course, the Holocaust changed this perception, but it can't be denied that settler colonialism was an early part of the deal.
I don't agree. I think too much is made of movies and films. And propagandists, I'm sure there are such things as propagandists, as Zionist propagandists, but but in terms of what was actually taking place politically, the point to be kept in mind is that in November of 1947, the Arab Higher Committee, whose leaders had actually been in Nazi Berlin and collaborated with the Nazi regime, the Arab Higher Committee, in spite of that, was given the opportunity to establish a state of its own on half of what had been British Mandate Palestine, including a coastal area in Gaza and in what is now northern Israel. And they rejected it. That is what needs to be kept in mind when people talk about settler colonialism or Jews who are oblivious to the inhabitants. Because if the Arab Higher Committee had accepted the partition resolution in 1947, then given the talent of the Palestine Arabs and a higher level of education than elsewhere in the Arab world, by now there would be two very viable states living side by side, probably peacefully. And there wouldn't be, you know, people talking about settler colonialism and oblivious Zionists who were expelling people or pretending that nobody lived there before. And Israel's moment does recall the sequence of events of 1947-48. Other historians such as Benny Morris and Uwe Bialer and many have done that as well. But Avi Eben, you know, famously said that the Palestinians never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And when one looks at the sequence of events, the tragedy is that the Palestine Arabs had absolutely atrocious, unbelievably atrocious leadership from the start. And that Palestinian nationalism of the Husseini variety had a lot to do with the fact that it was directed by people who had collaborated with the Nazis. It was a huge opportunity that they blew.
I think that Roy was referring to sort of filmic representations of
Yeah,
Palestine.
and I know, and certainly, there is there is a Zionist romanticism and a Zionist nationalism that is unbecoming, and that obscured the reality of Palestinian life. That is certainly the case, but that's not Ben Gurion and Moshe Sharett.
Hmm.
They were very aware that there were Arabs there, and what was on their minds was their vulnerability. They weren't only thinking about the Palestine Arabs; they were thinking about the Arab states that surrounded what became Israel,
Hmm.
and that their view was of being a small number of people facing a much larger number of people, and so the I
And stuck on the refugee issue as well, because I know that Roy thinks a lot about that, and we sort of all do. And among the misrepresentations that you would point out, I mean, one could certainly add too that the Jordanians, Egyptians, Iraqis, and Syrians were not fighting for an independent Palestine. They were fighting for their parts of Palestine. And yet, when I read the records, I'm always struck by sort of the absolute refusal to take back any Palestinian refugees, given the amount of pressure to do so. Now, of course, part of the pressure comes sort of insincerely from the Arab states themselves, and some of it comes sort of insincerely from the Vatican, and some of it says, well, this will, it comes from the UN, in sort of a well-meaning way, well, this will help ensure peace. But the thing that keeps coming back to me is that aside from the many ways that this refugee issue is different than others, is this: the fact that Israel was attacked from all sides did make Ben Gurion, Sharett, and the others think to themselves, we got to have more people. I mean, if this is how it's going to be, if there is a second round, if we are going to have difficulty procuring arms, Ben Gurion used to say we need at least 1 million people to be safe. Where are they going to live? There's an injustice to this, certainly, but as part, this struck me partly, just based on this issue that you're discussing, survival. And what if this happens again? And of course, it's going to happen again. And you need to bring in people, and you need to put them places, and they're terribly afraid of fifth columnists. And look, refugees, as awful as it was, refugees in far greater numbers were being settled in different parts. 12 million Germans, however many millions in Eastern Europe and Pakistan, and this is actually a much smaller number. And as some have pointed out, this is the one refugee problem from World War II and its aftermath that was never solved. But looking at it during Israel's moment, 1948, these geopolitical concerns and survival were sort of paramount. The Mufti was still out there in Cairo at the time.
Yeah, 2 points. Maybe the dean of Israeli historians of Israeli foreign policy is Uwe Bialer, and in his a people Israel foreign policy, a people may not dwell alone, must not dwell alone. He recalls the trauma of the war of 1947-48 and the enduring impact that had on Israeli foreign policy makers, that Israel could not lose a single war. And that the war had been terrible. And of course, I'm a German historian, and you mentioned the refugees in Europe, and something like 11 million Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe at the end of World War II, overwhelmingly not because they were Nazis, but because they were Germans. So this wasn't a careful assessment of who was in the SS and who was not, who had committed crimes. This was right. This was what goes around comes around, right? And we don't care what you've done. We just want you out of here because you're German, right? And in the 50s and 60s, the refugee lobby in West Germany kept talking about wanting to go back to our farm in Poland and our farm in Hungary. And the deal for peace in Europe finally was, you're not going back. Forget it. Make a new life here, because your desires to go back are just a formula for tension and war. So no, you're not going back. Give it up. Make a new life. Life is sometimes fair and life is sometimes unfair. Nobody's saying you deserved your fate, but we want peace. We don't want to have war, so you're not going back, period. And that's Ostpolitik, that's Willy Brandt, that's other German politicians. And that recognition that as tragic as 1948 was, it was a war the Arabs started. They started it. And when you lose a war, it's terrible to lose a war. But to have peace in the region means to finally acknowledge that, no, you're not going home. You know, you're going to make a new life. And what was true, for Europe, it would have been good if it had been true for the Middle East, but it wasn't. So readers of Israel's moment will, it casts a far more critical light on the Palestinian leadership than other works perhaps have done. I be frank that I think that the collaborationist history of the leaders of the Arab Higher Committee was one fundamental reason as to why they rejected the partition plan, which was a terrific deal for them. And when you are ideologically blinkered and you want to retain racial homogeneity, and then you fail, well, it's a terrible thing. But both the Palestinian propaganda campaigns of many decades have attempted to obscure these realities, and these realities have too often been obscured in American academic discussion as well. But this is not a polemical book. I have, as readers, as listeners, viewers know, I have strong views about this. But Israel's moment is not a rant. It's not it's a traditional work of historical scholarship, people can, as with any work of historical scholarship, readers can take issue with my emphasis on one thing or another, but I stand by what I wrote. I think this is what actually happened.
Well, we'll end with this because we're about out of time, but I strongly recommend the book to anybody. As you say at one point in the book, the State Department material on Palestine is massive. It's very, very, it takes a hell of an effort to get through it and make any sense of it, and you do. There's a tremendous amount of stuff in UN records that you bring out, and it's always striking how diplomatic historians often ignore General Assembly and First Committee debates, but there's really fascinating stuff in there. The material on France and its policies is new, but the stuff on the Mufti and how that affects all of this is very new as well. In other words, there's an awful lot in here that's new, and there's an awful lot to think about as well. And I strongly recommend the book. I'm going to thank everybody for staying and listening and for their thoughtful questions. And finally, I want to thank Jeffrey Herf for being our guest for this event. It was fascinating stuff.
Well, thank you very, very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Everybody, I just want to remind you, our events if you've missed one, they're recorded on our YouTube channel and also on our Facebook page. Keep checking back to our website for future events and for our classes for the fall. Everybody have a good night.